Chester Burnett had a voice like a freight train hitting a wall. That was the first thing people noticed about Howlin Wolf. Before the guitar, before the harmonica, before anything else. The voice, raw and enormous, something that seemed to come from the ground itself, from the dirt roads of Mississippi where he'd learned to play, watching Charlie Patton from the edge of a field. By 1967, Wolf was 57 years old and had earned every single year of it. He wasn't the biggest name in rock music anymore. He wasn't supposed to be. He was something older than rock music, something that had existed before it and would, in his estimation, exist long after it collapsed under its own weight. He had opinions about what was happening to the blues. Loud ones. He'd earned that right in a way most people hadn't. Wolf had picked cotton as a boy. He'd played street corners and juke joints and roadhouses where the floor was dirt and the audience wasn't always friendly. Music for Wolf was not a career choice. It was the thing that had kept him from disappearing entirely into a life that would have swallowed him whole. That history lived in his playing, and he knew it, and he believed, sincerely, not arrogantly, that you could not fake that kind of weight. The music had been taken. That was how Wolf put it, privately and publicly, carefully and carelessly, depending on who was listening. The British kids had come over with their long hair and their loud amplifiers, and they'd learned his songs, Rolling Stones, Animals, all of them. And then they'd turn them into something else, something that sold, something that filled arenas. And the men who created those songs in the first place were still playing the south side of Chicago for $25 a night. That was one thing. Jimi Hendrix was another thing entirely. Wolf had heard the records. Are You Experienced? Purple Haze. He'd listened carefully, the way a man listens when he's looking for something to be right about. And he found it. That's not blues, he told people. That's a man making noise and calling it feeling. He wasn't entirely wrong. He wasn't entirely right either. But nobody told him that. It was a Tuesday night in Chicago, late 1967. The exact venue changes depending on who tells the story. Some say a bar on the south side. Others say a private apartment. One account puts it in a rehearsal room above a record store. But the people who were there agree on the essentials. A backroom gathering, maybe 30 people. Musicians, mostly. The kind of place where serious conversations happened, where no one was performing for an audience because the audience was everyone in the room. Coats on chairs, bottles passed without ceremony. Music talked about the way other people talk about religion or money or the weather, as something that was always present, always mattering, always slightly out of reach. Wolf arrived the way he always did, taking up space before he'd said a word. At 6'3" and well over 200 pounds, Chester Burnett was not a man who entered rooms quietly. He sat down, accepted a drink, and began holding court the way he had for decades. Jimi was already there. He was in the corner with a Stratocaster, not plugged into anything, just running his fingers along the strings the way some people tap a table. Not performing. Thinking, maybe, or not thinking at all. It was hard to tell with Jimi. His face didn't give much away when he was playing to himself like that. Someone introduced them. Wolf looked at the young man in the corner for a moment. Then he looked back at the people he'd been talking to. "I know who he is," Wolf said. It didn't start as a confrontation. These things rarely do. Wolf was talking about the blues, which was his favorite subject, specifically about what had happened to it, which was his favorite complaint. He talked about Son House. He talked about Robert Johnson. He talked about what it meant to play a song that came from somewhere real, somewhere that hurt, and the difference between that and playing a song that only sounded like it hurt. These young guitarists, Wolf said, and he didn't look at Jimi when he said it, which was its own kind of look. They plug in and they turn it up, and they think volume is emotion. They think feedback is feeling. They don't know what the blues costs. They never paid for it. The room had gone careful, not silent, but careful. The kind of room that's listening without admitting it. Jimi stopped moving his fingers on the strings. He didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there. Someone across the room refilled a glass. A floorboard settled somewhere. "What does it cost?" Jimi said. Wolf looked at him then, really looked. "More than you paid," Wolf said. There was a guitar case near the wall, an acoustic guitar, someone's. old, a little beaten up, the kind of instrument that had been played seriously for years by someone who meant it. Jimmy stood up, walked over to it, and picked it up without asking. He sat back down, tuned it by ear, slowly, not rushing. The room stayed careful. Wolf watched him tune, and his expression didn't change. He had the patience of a man who had been waiting his whole life for things to prove him right. Jimmy settled the guitar on his knee. He started playing. He didn't play Purple Haze. He didn't play anything from his records. He played Robert Johnson, Crossroad Blues, the song that Wolf's generation had learned from a scratchy 78 and taught themselves note by note in the dark. But not the way Johnson played it, not the way anyone had played it. The first thing people noticed was the finger picking. No pick, just his thumb and fingers, separating the bass line from the melody, running them simultaneously the way the old Delta players did, but with a precision that made it sound almost architectural. Clean and purposeful, each note landing exactly where it was supposed to land. And then there was something else. Jimmy was playing the Johnson melody, but underneath it, threading through it, were harmonic choices that shouldn't have worked. Jazz intervals, almost. Things that Robert Johnson hadn't put there, couldn't have put there, but that sounded like they'd been waiting in the song all along, hiding inside it until someone thought to look. The room had stopped being careful. Now it was just quiet. Wolf didn't move. Jimmy's voice when he started singing was lower than on his records. Not a performance voice, something stripped back. He sang Johnson's words exactly, not changing them, not reinventing them, letting them be what they were. But the way he phrased them made them sound like they were coming from somewhere specific, some real and private place. And that specificity was the thing that made people in that room look at the floor or the ceiling or anywhere except at each other. Nobody wanted to be seen feeling something. He played for maybe 5 minutes, not long. The song is not a long song. When he finished, he sat with his hands resting on the guitar. Not looking at Wolf, not looking at anyone. Just sitting the way he'd been sitting when Wolf arrived, like nothing had happened and nothing hadn't happened. The room stayed quiet for a beat longer than it needed to. Then someone started talking again, too quickly, about something else, and the room went back to being a room. Wolf hadn't moved. He was sitting in exactly the same position he'd been in when Jimmy started playing. His drink was in his hand, but he hadn't touched it. He was looking at the wall to his left, or not looking at it, using it as a place to put his eyes while he worked through something. Jimmy set the guitar carefully back against the wall. He went back to his corner. Nobody said anything about what had just happened. That was the agreement, unspoken, the way those agreements always are. You don't name the thing while it's still in the room. Wolf left about an hour later. He said goodnight to the people near the door. He didn't say anything to Jimmy. That was noted. People noticed when Wolf didn't say something. He was not a man who withheld words out of politeness or uncertainty. When Wolf went quiet, it was because he was working through something that wasn't ready to be spoken yet. In the car on the way back, he was quiet for a long time. The man driving him later said Wolf didn't speak for nearly 20 minutes. When he finally did, he said something that the driver didn't fully understand at the time, didn't understand until years later when he was telling the story to someone else and heard his own words land differently. He found something in there I put down years ago, Wolf said. That was all. Wolf never publicly changed his position on Jimi Hendrix. Not exactly. He continued to make his arguments about the blues, about its roots, about the difference between borrowing a tradition and living inside one. He was not entirely wrong about any of it, but in interviews from the early 1970s, something had shifted. When Jimmy's name came up, the dismissal was gone. Not replaced with praise exactly. Something more complicated than praise. In one interview, a journalist pushed him, asked him directly what he thought of Hendrix's guitar playing. Wolf was quiet for a moment. That boy went somewhere with the blues, he finally said. Somewhere I never went. Somewhere I'm not sure I could have gone. He paused. I don't know if that's the same place I was pointing to or a different place altogether. But it was a real place, I know that much. The journalist wrote it down and didn't follow up. Some answers closed the door on the next question. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970. He was 27 years old. Wolf played a show 3 days later. The set list was the same as always. He didn't dedicate anything to Jimmy publicly. He didn't make a speech. But someone who was at that show, standing close to the stage, said that in the middle of smokestack lightning, Wolf stopped. Just for a second. Longer than a breath, shorter than a bar. His eyes went somewhere else. Then he came back and finished the song like nothing had interrupted it. Nobody asked him about it afterward. You didn't ask Wolf about pauses. Howlin Wolf died in January 1976. He left behind a catalog of recordings that defined what the electric blues could be and could mean. His voice, that freight train voice, is still there on those records, still arriving from the ground, from Mississippi, from something older than almost anything in American music. He also left behind a handful of interviews, a few offhand comments made in rooms that weren't set up for history, and one quiet sentence said in a moving car to a man who was just supposed to be driving. He found something in there I put down years ago. Nobody's entirely sure what Wolf put down, or when, or whether he ever picked it back up. The best guesses are just guesses, but the sentence stayed, the way some sentences do. That Tuesday night in Chicago, Howlin Wolf challenged Jimi Hendrix to justify himself, to prove that the blues running through his music was real, that it had cost something, that it hadn't just been borrowed for the electricity and the arena lights and then discarded. Jimmy didn't argue. He picked up someone else's guitar and played Robert Johnson and let the song answer the question. Whether it answered it the way Wolf expected, or the way Jimmy intended, or some third way that neither of them chose, nobody knows. That's the thing about a real musical conversation. It goes somewhere the people having it didn't necessarily plan for. What's known as this: a man who had never been silenced by anyone sat quietly in a room for an hour afterward. He got into a car. He looked out the window at a city going dark. And he said the only honest thing he knew how to say: that's enough to know.